Today on Dirt Lifestyle, we're going to talk about everything you need to know to select the right gear ratio for your axles. Your gear ratios are directly related to everything from drivability to fuel economy. Changing your tire size will throw off your shift points, your speedometer, and rob tons of power. So choosing the right ratios that match your purpose and your tire size is absolutely paramount. I'm going to start this video with the basic concepts, and then we're going to move our way up to the more complicated stuff. And you'll see why as we go throughout the video. But right here at the very beginning, for anybody who's new, this is a really good way to get your head in the game and understand these changes, and I'm going to give you a formula right here at the beginning of the video that's going to get you in the ballpark of what you need. So first things first, for those of you who aren't quite sure what the ratios mean, your drive shaft goes into your pinion gear goes onto your ring gear, and then your axle shaft would go in this way, and your axle shaft connects to your tire. So the drive shaft comes from your engine, your drivetrain. It then spins these gears, and then that'll spin your tires. It's super simple. So if we have a 4:10 ratio, that means that it's 4.1 to 1. So anytime someone says 410 or someone says 373 or 538, that's what they mean, is 373 to 1, 410 to 1, 538 to 1. And what these numbers mean is it's 4.1 rotations of our pinion gear for every one rotation of that very poorly drawn ring gear that I did there. So it's a super simple concept, and now that you have that understanding, we can move on to how the formula works. And there's a number of different formulas out there. There's also a bunch of charts that you can go off of, but I think that this is a good formula to get you in the ballpark. So we've got our new tire size. Let's say that we want to go to a 35, divided by our old tire size. Let's say that it's a 29. You times that by the old gear ratio. So you look it up online, you find out what your existing gear ratio is. In this instance, it's going to be a 3.54, which is definitely a highway gear, not really a good off-road gear. So that's going to equal our new ratio, which by this calculation, or by this formula rather, it's a 4.27 to 1 ratio. I always recommend rounding up. So let's say that we did all this math and it ended up being like a 4.40 or something like that. I would round up to a 4.56. A 4.27 is not a super common ratio, so I would just round up to a 4.56. And the reason I recommend you round up is because if you're going to a larger tire, it's going to demand more energy, it's going to demand more power. So whenever you can round up to the next numerically higher gear, which is going to give you a little bit deeper gear, you're going to gain back some of that factory performance, and in some cases you can actually have more than factory performance because you're going to actually be able to transfer more torque to the tires and then more power to the road. So this is a really good generic way to get close to what you need to know in terms of what gear ratio to choose. And I think if you're just going from a 29 to a 35, this works pretty good. If you're a gearhead like me and you have a little bit broader understanding of how a vehicle works, how transmission ratios work, how the power band in your engine works, I think that there's a better way to do this. I think that this formula works great for a lot of people, but when you're someone who has a really good understanding of the relationships of these different systems, I use calculators, and you're gonna see in just a minute how I do it. But I think there's a way to make a more accurate decision on what gear ratio we need based on the purpose of our vehicle. The way that I like to do this is I'm gonna hop onto the internet, I'm gonna open up 4 tabs, and the example vehicle we're gonna use today, because I've gotten a lot of questions about it, is my Land Rover Discovery that I just put 1-ton axles and 37s on. And this isn't a cookie cutter build. It's not as simple as looking at a graph or a chart to figure out what gear ratios to use here. So I'm going to walk you guys through the exact steps that I take in order to figure out what ratios to use in a vehicle like this. So I'm gonna open up 4 tabs right out of the gate. We've got Land Rover Discovery technical specifications on a website called Driver's Side. There's probably a bunch of websites that do this. I like this one because it's all the different specs we need all on one page. We have factory tire size, we have like where our peak torque comes in, we've got all of our ratios for the transmission, transfer case, rear axle, it's all right here. So for this Discovery, I already went ahead just to make this easier to shoot, and I put in the factory ratios into a engine RPM calculator on a website called Crawlpedia. So the other 3 tabs that I'm opening up are all for a website called Crawlpedia. And Crawlpedia is sweet because we just put in the factory Land Rover axle ratio, the factory tire diameter. I want to be cruising at 70 miles an hour, and then fourth gear, excuse me, overdrive is 4th gear on this transmission, and it is 0.73. So our engine speed at 70 is going to be just about 2100 RPM. So that's pretty conservative. And the reason that Land Rover will have their vehicle set up this way stock is probably lower emissions at a lower RPM. It's going to get a little bit better MPG. So this is conservative at 2100. Now, the closer we get to our peak torque, the more power, the more performance we're going to get on and off road. But the sacrifice, of course, is going to be mileage. So this is how I have mine set up on this Disco with the 1-ton axles. I did a 5.38 to 1 gear ratio, which I know is kind of controversial. I've had a lot of people ask me about that. Tire diameter is 37, same speed, same transmission ratio. Now we are at 2,500 RPM. So we're going to make a sacrifice in terms of MPG, potentially. But we're adding a lot of weight and asking a ton out of this vehicle, which is why I want to make more RPM to get this closer to our peak torque number while we're driving down the freeway, because freeways where I live are not flat. There's a lot of ups, a lot of downs, and I want to have plenty of power so I'm not constantly having to drop a bunch of gears to get up a hill because I'm using a worn out old V8 to get up that hill, and I'm going to be moving a lot of weight. So the factory weight on this vehicle is around 5,000. I think that loaded down with these bigger axles, bigger tires, all of our gear, our family and everything to go on a wheeling trip, or to go on an overlanding trip rather, I bet you we're going to be close to 6,500, 7 should be very realistic. And that's a lot of extra demand out of this engine. And the closer I get to our peak torque number, which if we look at this driver's side, we've got peak torque as 300 foot-pounds at 2,600 RPM. So we're only 100 RPM away from our peak torque. So we're way closer to our peak torque number, which is going to give us much better performance on hills and whatnot. And there are going to be occasions where I'm going to be pulling a small trailer for overlanding behind it. So I'm going to need all 300 foot-pounds at times. And I think that this is a very realistic way to look at what kind of performance we can expect out of this once I hit the freeway with it. So there's something else we need to figure out with our ratios, and that is our crawl ratio. Crawl ratio is really important for off-road, and this one's not bad. So our transmission for first gear is a 2.48 to 1, our transfer case is a 3.27, and our axle is a 5.38. For an automatic, I personally think that trails and whatnot are perfect at like a 40 to 1 crawl ratio. Automatics are so forgiving. I mean, just ridiculously more forgiving than a manual. So I think that we're right in there for a good trail rig. Now for hardcore rocks and stuff, I think that an automatic would be better in like a 50 to 1, somewhere closer to that, because it just gives you a little bit more control on steep stuff and on, obstacles. So you're not having to give it a whole bunch of throttle for it to lock the torque converter, and then you start to go up. And then once you get up to the top, you got to hit the brakes because you're going too fast. The deeper this crawl ratio goes, the more control you have to slowly creep over the rocks. And then if you want to stop, you just slowly hit the brake, and it's not as eventful. So I think that this is going to be great for trails. It'll be okay for rocks, but I built it more for trails than for rocks. So this 538 is getting us right in there where I want to be off-road. And then for our freeway speeds, it's going to be much more into the power that I'm going to need in order to move this heavy vehicle down the roadway. So for if you're watching this and you have a manual, I would recommend going way deeper. I wheel a manual regularly, and I like to do crazy rocks with it. I think that if you have a manual and you want to do rocks, 100 to 1 is what you want to shoot for. If you want to do trails with a manual, 80 to 1 is pretty good. And you could still do some rocks for sure. But if you want to do hard rocks like what I do, 100 to 1 to me is like a minimum. I think I'm at like 117 to 1 the way I'm set up, and it's perfect. The clutch is basically an on and off button, which makes it so much more controllable whenever I'm going over those really big obstacles. A couple more things that are worth considering whenever you are picking out ring and pinion ratios. One is the deeper you go, so the numerically higher gear set you have, the weaker the ring and pinion becomes. So this is a great example. We've got Dana 60 ring gear here, Dana 60 ring gear there, Dana 60 pinion here, Dana 60 pinion there. Notice the difference in the size of those two pinions. That's a big difference in strength. So this is a 411 gear ratio. This is a 538 gear ratio. As you go deeper in the gears, you're going to have a smaller and smaller pinion, and this is going to change the strength of your ring and pinion substantially. So this is why it's good to understand this before you choose what axle you are going to improve, because if you have a small axle like a Dana 30, this gets so tiny that you end up having a very big weak point between your pinion gear and your ring gear. So then it's time to upgrade to a Dana 44, or in this case, a Dana 60. Look, this is a small pinion and it's on a Dana 60. Imagine how small a 538 is on a Dana 44 or on a Dana 30. It is tiny. So these are all things that are worth taking into consideration. One more thing is what is called a carrier brake. So you're going to see this when you're choosing your gears, and it's making reference to the deck height. So this is a high-speed carrier, and whenever you get into a low-speed carrier, the deck height right here changes. So with a high-speed carrier, I think it's anything that's a 411 and numerically lower is a high-speed carrier. So this is a 411, so a 373, a 327, a 354, all those would fit into a high-speed carrier. But if you go to a low-speed carrier, this height ends up going up a little bit, and it makes it to where you can't use high-speed gears, with an exception. We'll get to that exception here in a minute. So visualize a low-speed carrier having a deck that is taller. And the reason for that is as this pinion gets smaller and smaller, they end up making this ring gear thicker and thicker. So I don't know if thick gears have been around forever, but it's something that over like the last 5 or 10 years I've noticed gain a lot of popularity. And what happens is by the time you get to 538s, well, it's 456 is when you are supposed to change to a low speed carrier. And the reason for that is I think it's just maybe material cost or whatever. They don't want this to get so crazy thick. So you can buy thick gears to make it so you can mount the ring and pinion, that's a 538, on a high-speed carrier, but traditionally you just get a low-speed carrier with a different deck height, and then this ring gear doesn't end up getting so thick. I don't know why it getting thick is a problem, but this is how the engineers have engineered these carriers, and this is common throughout all the Dana axles and many other axles as well. So whenever people are talking about a carrier brake, that is what they're talking about. And if you have a low-speed carrier that you want to keep on your axle, if you have a high-speed carrier that you want to keep on your axle and you don't want to change the carrier out whenever you're going to a 456 or a 488, you can get a thick gear set, and then it'll make it to where you can mount low-speed gears onto a high-speed carrier. I hope this video makes sense. This is a complicated topic, and it's difficult to communicate all this stuff in a way that is super absorbable. So I did my best. I hope that you guys at very least enjoy it. But now it's time to get to the comments on the last video. So the last video was all about that sweet Evolution saw that I've had for the last few months, and I've got a whole bunch of comments on it. First question is from Tim Brown. I have the Makita abrasive saw. Is it worth upgrading? Does it make a big mess, or does it catch most of the metal chips? Thanks for the good content as usual. Thank you, Tim, for the comment. So it does make a mess, but it's not as crazy as the mess that you get out of an abrasive saw. Abrasive saw blows dust everywhere. It's crazy. Most of the chips, more than 90% of the chips from this chop saw they land where they're supposed to, and they're contained inside the saw. But there are plenty of chips that also land in like a 2-foot radius around this thing. So it does still make a mess. But in my opinion, after using both, I've used abrasive saws a lot, and now I've used this Evolution chop saw a lot. It is absolutely worth the upgrade. I would never buy an abrasive saw personally. They're too slow. They're too smoky. There's just too many things that I don't like about them. But, and I mean, you do wear through the discs pretty quickly. And because the discs are a little bit floppy, it's easy to make a crooked cut, which sounds crazy. It's kind of counterintuitive if you've never used one. But especially if you have it at like an angle, it's easy for it to kind of bow a little bit. And I just don't like abrasive saws. So in my personal opinion, it's absolutely worth spending the money and upgrading to one of these. Next question is from DJ Thump DJ. Can I just buy the blade and mount it on my 14-inch abrasion chop saw, or does the blade need its own saw for some reason? So what I would do is I would look up the RPM of your specific chop saw, your specific abrasive saw, and then find out what the RPM is of the Evolution saw, because I think that that is going to be a very crucial ingredient as to how the blade lasts so long on the Evolution saw. If you go too fast, it's going to burn it up. If you go too slow, could possibly burn it up. So I think that Evolution probably sized this thing to the absolute perfect RPM to make the blade last the longest. So that's my only piece of advice if you were going to try to adapt one of these awesome blades to an abrasive saw. Next comment is from Bravo Whiskey. If the disco engine overheats, a 2.8 liter Cummins swap would make for good TV. Yes, it would. I would love to do that. Trust me, I've been wanting to get my hands on one of those Cummins 2.8s for a long time. I mean, it's made by a company called Photon, which is a subsidiary of, or a partnership, I guess, with Cummins, and it's made in China. So I'm a little weary on that front, which is why I haven't gone out and bought one of these new motors. But everything I hear is good. I'm a huge Cummins fan. If this R2.8 over the next couple of years lives up to what it could be, it's possible that that engine could find its way into the Land Rover Discovery, because even if I have perfect reliability, I'm a diesel guy. I like low-end torque, I like good MPG, and it would be sweet to swap a brand new Cummins into that thing. But we'll see, time will tell. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to help support the channel, you can go to thedirtlifestyle.com. We have t-shirts, hats, stickers, neck gaiters. We have a link to our Patreon account. We also have a new Facebook group called Dirtbag Mafia. So if you type that in on the search on Facebook, it should show up. I think there's a couple different groups, but ours is probably the big one by now. And it's awesome. It's a great place where so many of you guys ask me questions that I just can't answer anymore because the channel's too big. There's not enough hours in the day to answer thousands of comments a day. But this is a great place with a lot of knowledgeable people. So if you have questions for me, you can ask them on that group, and there's other people that are really knowledgeable too. And if I can't answer it on the group, which I do answer a lot of questions on there, somebody else is definitely going to be able to help you out with some good information. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm @DirtLifestyleNate. We'll see you next time.